Greetings and welcome to this webinar on remembering past massacres in Africa. This webinar is brought to you by the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, CCIA, of the World Council of Churches. The Commission is marking this year its 75th anniversary. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Isabelle Apao-Ferry. She is the Deputy General Secretary for Public Witness and Diaconia at the WCC since 2012. She also gives oversight to the WCC Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, WCC's work on human sexuality, WCC's work on just community of women and men, as well as WCC's work on overcoming racism. She is a Presbyterian from Malawi. Previously, she was full professor of African theology, dean and head of the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Her co-facilitator will be Reverend Dr Mikey Roberts. He is the program executive for Spiritual Life and Faith in Order at the WCC since 2019. In this capacity, he coordinates the daily prayers at the WCC and also gives leadership to the musical and spiritual life initiatives of the WCC. He was born and raised on the island of Antigua and was ordained as a pastor within the Moravian Church, Eastern West Indies province 28 years ago. Without further delay, I invite both of you to guide us in this conversation.
Thank you very much, Sigma. And in case you didn't catch it, Sigma is the program executive in the Commission of the Churches in International Affairs. I want to welcome you all, to this webinar on remembering past massacres, honoring the legacy and resilience of the victims. And this time we are focusing on Africa. So many of the stories we will be hearing today are either forgotten or some falling into world amnesia. The poster of this webinar is the Yekatit 12 monument in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. It is the memorial for Ethiopians who were murdered during the occupation of the country by the Italians in 1936 to 1941. The black shirts killed an estimated 20% of the population in 3 days' time. This event is a conversation, not a presentation of papers or a lecture. It will be a short remembering and honoring. It will involve short, meditative, instrumental interludes as intercessions. We also want to finish on a positive note by honoring the work that some churches have done in healing past wounds and advocating for a just and equitable society. So I now hand over to Mikey to introduce the speakers.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Welcome to all. And for today's webinar, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you briefly our speakers for today. First, we have the Reverend Dr. Frank Chikane, who is the moderator of the WCC's Commission of the Churches on International Affairs. He is an emeritus pastor of the Apostolic Faith Mission of South Africa and formerly the pastor of the AFM in Naledi, as well as an international president of the AFM International for 23 years up until the year 2019. He was the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches, the Director of the Institute for Contextual Theology, and also a former member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. We also have with us today Mrs. Fasino Evelyn, and she is a certified retired professor and a graduate from the École Normale Supérieure du Benin in Life and Earth Sciences. She holds a master's in strategic planning and program budgeting, and also courses in equity and gender. In the past, she has served as the departmental director of primary and secondary education, and she's a member of the Presbyterian Church. We are also delighted to have with us this day as well, Father Michael Lapsley, who is New Zealand by birth and South African priest, Anglican priest, and he also belongs to the Society of the Sacred Mission. While serving as a priest in South Africa, Father Lapsley became involved in the politics of the country as he felt led that it was his duty to speak out against the injustices of the apartheid regime. In 1976, the government then exiled him for his affiliation to the ANC, as well as his support for the students after the 1976 student uprising. Later on, while in exile in Zimbabwe, Father Lapsley was indeed, unfortunately, the target of an attempted assassination on his life. And this attempt on his life was organized by the Civil Cooperation Bureau, a convert organization of the South African government security apparatus. Since then, he has dedicated his life to helping others deal with the suffering and scars inflicted by oppressive regimes. We are also happy to have today Mr. Francis Maroki. He's a lecturer in communications at Tangaza University College, and which is a constituent college of the Catholic University of Eastern Africa. He holds a master's degree in development communication from Daystar University in Nairobi, Kenya, and a bachelor's of arts degree in journalism and mass communication from the same university. He's a consultant editor and a media trainer. Currently, he's the editor of the monthly magazine of a large Catholic congregation, and he works as a media consultant for the Kenya Conference of Catholic Bishops. And finally, we have the Reverend Dr Nagarju Mook, who is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church in Rwanda since 2000. She has served 3 congregations in her home country, and currently she is serving at the Zinga Presbytery. Since October 2016, she has worked as the Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Evangelical Mission in the Africa Regional Office, which is based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. She is also currently serving as a full-time lecturer at the Protestant Institute of Arts and Social Sciences in Rwanda, where she teaches missiology and peace building in the Great Lake region. We are delighted to have all of our presenters, and based on their bios, I'm sure that this will be a very, very enlightening discussion. Over to you, Isabel.
I agree with you, Mike, that we do have a very impressive panel. And I want now, to call upon our panelists, to get ready and respond to this question. Your respective communities have experienced, several massacres and mass killings. Can you identify one and briefly share with us the context in which it happened. We'll start with Mrs. Fasino. Yes?
Oui.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Yes. Bonjour à tous, les panélistes de Cotonou. Je vous dis bonjour et merci de suivre cette présentation qui concerne les massacres au Bénin en 1897. Cette présentation se fera en deux temps. D'abord, le contexte dans lequel cela s'est passé, puis ensuite, est-ce qu'il y a eu des efforts de réparation. Pour ce qui concerne le contexte, je voudrais d'abord faire une petite clarification au sujet du nom Bénin qui a été utilisé ici. Lorsque nous parlons des massacres du Bénin, en réalité, le Bénin dont il s'agit, c'est le royaume du Bénin, et qu'il ne faudrait pas confondre avec la République du Bénin, parce qu'aujourd'hui, la République du Bénin était, pendant la colonisation, le royaume du Dahomey. Et par contre, le Bénin dont il s'agit là maintenant, et qu'on peut encore appeler Bénin City, est un royaume qui existait au temps de la colonisation et qui a été plus tard annexé à la République fédérale du Nigeria. Donc, voilà la clarification que je souhaiterais faire pour que l'on se situe par rapport à ce terme de Bénin. Alors, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé pour que l'on parle de massacre? En réalité, le royaume du Bénin, dans le temps, était un royaume très prospère et qui était convoité par les Britanniques. Mais à un moment donné, c'est un royaume qui a commencé son déclin. Et lorsque le déclin a commencé, les Britanniques en ont profité pour vouloir intégrer, prendre d'assaut ce royaume et signer avec le roi d'alors qui s'appelle roi Oba, signer un traité de protectorat. Le roi, dans un premier temps, n'avait pas voulu accéder à cet accord, mais finalement, il a été contraint à signer l'accord du traité de protectorat. Et c'est après cette signature, dans un premier temps, il ne voulait pas, mais il a fini par signer. Et malheureusement, les Britanniques, ce qu'ils espéraient tirer de ce traité-là, ils ne l'ont pas eu parce qu'ils voulaient prendre le contrôle des exportations, notamment les exportations en huile palmier, en huile de palme, mais ils n'ont pas pu tirer grand profit de ce traité-là. Et furieux de ce fait qu'ils n'ont pas pu tirer profit de ce traité, ils ont voulu envahir le royaume. La décision, pendant qu'elle était en train d'être mûrie pour savoir quand est-ce qu'il faut envahir et comment le faire, le vice-consul d'alors n'a même pas attendu cette décision. Et là, il a envoyé un détachement, il a conduit un détachement vers le royaume de Bénin City. Alors, le détachement qui est arrivé a été intercepté par les chefs du palais du roi et qui ont massacré aussi bien le vice-consul et ceux qui étaient avec lui. Il était accompagné de 9 Britanniques et de centaines de porteurs noirs. Les Britanniques, parmi les 9 Britanniques, 7 ont été massacrés avec le vice-consul. Et le mot massacre, le terme massacre vient de cette interception de l'envahisseur qui sont les Britanniques. Donc, il ne s'agit pas ici du massacre de la population du royaume de Benin City, mais c'est le massacre du détachement britannique qui a envahi le royaume. Donc, souvent, lorsqu'on parle de massacre, on fait cette confusion-là. Et c'est du fait que ce massacre-là n'est pas le massacre de la population, le massacre n'a pas été reconnu, donc il n'y a pas eu par la suite d'efforts de réparation. Donc voilà le contexte dans lequel on a parlé de massacre, c'est le massacre de l'expédition britannique et non le massacre de la population du royaume de Benin City. Et c'est suite à ce massacre-là que les Britanniques ont envoyé cette fois-ci une autre expédition qui est une expédition punitive, en quelque sorte pour punir le royaume, pour punir le roi et ses chefs parce qu'ils ont attaqué et massacré la première expédition qui est allée là-bas. Et c'est suite à cette expédition punitive que le royaume a été saccagé, les biens du roi ont été pillés, le roi lui-même a été traduit devant une cour de justice, les chefs du palais ont été condamnés à mort et tous les fruits du pillage, le butin a été emporté. Donc voilà brièvement le contexte dans lequel ce massacre-là a eu lieu. Donc, je précise qu'il s'agit du massacre du détachement britannique et non du massacre de la population. Je vous remercie. Et maintenant, puisque ce n'est pas un massacre qui a été reconnu, donc il n'y a pas eu d'effort de réparation. Il y aurait eu d'efforts de réparation si c'était la population, si la communauté internationale avait reconnu que la population de ce royaume a été massacrée. Mais du fait que ce sont les Britanniques, les envahisseurs qui ont été massacrés, donc ce n'est pas un événement qui est reconnu au niveau international. Mais en termes de réparation, tout ce qui a été fait jusque-là, c'est voir dans quelle mesure restituer les biens, restituer les objets qui ont été pillés. Parce que ces objets...
Can I just interrupt you there? I think let's concentrate on what happened, and then I'll ask you to come back, to look at the reparation side of it. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, we've learned a lot, showing us the difference between what happened to the British and what happened to the local people, and that they recognized only what happened to the few British, but not the majority of the population that were massacred, by the British. So thank you so much. Now let's hear from Mr. Maroki from Kenya.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you very much, everyone. I am looking at the massacre known as the Lari Massacre. And the Lari Massacre, in the context of Kenya's liberation struggle, in the fight for independence in the early 50s and leading to independence of the country. The name Lari is a small village in the central part of Kenya, and Lari is on the route to the Aberdare forest. The freedom struggle in Kenya, the movement that was spearheading the struggle for independence, was led by a group of the freedom fighters known as the Mau Mau. Now, they lived and settled in the forests to hide from the British colonialists. And therefore, the name Lari is a village that is right on the foot of the Aberdare forest where the Mau Mau were hiding. Now, as we talk about the Lari Massacre, it's important to note that this is a massacre that led to the death of more than 5,000 people, which includes the actual people and the aftermath of this massacre. And also this led to the annihilation of more than 30% of the Kikuyu people or the Kikuyu population that was leading in the struggle for independence. Now, it is important to note that the movement to fight for the independence of this country was led by the people, the Mau Mau War. The Mau Mau is a liberation war. And therefore, it was a war to liberate the country from the colonial powers, from the colonial yoke, and from the oppression of the British colonialists, or rather the British people. The British colonizers, this movement for fighting for independence, it was a struggle for human rights, human dignity, and oppression from the colonial masters. The British colonial masters who oppressed the Africans or the Kenyans for over 70 years. They took away their land, their freedom, their human rights, and human dignity. The Mau Mau have been called terrorists and guerrillas by some historians, but it is important to know that they were not terrorists. They were people on a mission to fight for their independence. These were men and women of the soil committed to liberating their motherland from the colonial aggressors and the oppressors. And so anything done by the Mau Mau should be seen in the light against this background. The British colonial administrators arrived in Kenya around 1895 under the disguise of the British Imperial Company of East Africa. In other words, to do business. Then later, the British settlers systematically acquired the African land and their property. Slowly but surely, they pushed the natives to the peripherals. And these settlers took most of the productive land and introduced what they called the European settlers, pushing the Kenyans and the Africans into the peripheral. They pushed them from their ancestral lands and put them in reserve areas and introduced a tax that they called heart tax. That means a tax for every house. And by the first quarter of the 19th century, the Africans began feeling the pressure from these colonial masters. The Africans were forced to participate and enter into the First and Second World Wars without really knowing what the war was all about. The Africans were used as carrier corps. In fact, today in Nairobi, we have an estate known as carrier corps, which is a corruption of the English word carrier corps. So when these carrier corps returned from Ceylon and Burma, they had already gained confidence and knowledge that the African was actually a visitor, and there was need to remove this African from our soil. So what happened is that around in 1952, the British government introduced a state of emergency in our country and arrested all the leading political leaders, such as Jomo Kenyatta, Fred Kubai, Paul Ngei, Ochieng Oneko, Kungu Karumba, and Fred Kubai. When these leaders were arrested, the Africans said, "Why do you arrest our leaders?" So the Africans went into the bush to begin to demand the release of these so-called Kapenguria 6. And we have always celebrated the day of their arrest, the 20th of October, 1952, as a national holiday.
Okay.
Because they were arresting the Africans, these young men who remained, they had to go to the bush. And when they went to the bush, they had to find a way of survival. And one of the ways of survival was they had to get food and they had to hide. So it happened that in Lari, where they were taking refuge, they used to receive food and other amenities from the local community. But the chiefs, the colonial chiefs, the chiefs who are sympathizers of the British colonialists, betrayed the presence of these Africans. And so the liberation fighters had to make a statement that you're not going to play around with us. So they identified the people who are sellouts. And one night around 1953, the village of Lari was attacked by the Mau Mau fighters and completely wiped out the village. Every surviving animal or human being, starting with the chief and the people that region, they completely wiped out the village. Now, historians record that about 200 people were living in the village and they were removed. But the aftermath of that, immediately after that attack, the British released soldiers and the colonialists to hunt for the Mau Mau, to hunt for the people who attacked the village. And the aftermath of this attack, another 5,000 Africans were killed over a period of time, and a lot of other people were rounded up because there was a lot of oath taking. The Africans were taking the oath to protect their land. So the colonialists went out to hunt for everybody who was involved in the oath taking. And this involved
I think we stop there for now.
Yes.
And then I'll call you again, and then you can give us more information.
Thank you very much.
Right. So thank you. As you were speaking, I'm just thinking of my country, Malawi, because the experiences are so similar.
Oh.
Right. Now let's hear from Reverend Dr. Mukey.
Dr. Mukey, you need to unmute yourself. We are still not hearing you, unfortunately. Yes, just unmute. Okay,
Yes,
there you go. Yeah.
I'm just saying that I'm happy that I am invited to join this webinar where we African can share the memory and honor the massacre that happened in Africa in different countries. So I am requested to talk about the context in which massacres happened in Rwanda and in DRC. Since the time is not so much, but I think I can highlight some point in the two countries. Starting where I am living now in Rwanda, the context in which massacre happened in Rwanda. Normally, massacre in Rwanda, there were many massacres, but the most worth it was happening in 1994, which is a genocide perpetrated against the Tutsi. Historically, Rwanda has three ethnic groups. This is Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa. These groups, they share same language, they share same culture, and same religion. They had one king who was like unifying the entire community or the three ethnic group. However, during the colonial period, the monarchy or the king who was from the Tutsi community lost much of its legitimacy as it became increasingly identified with Tutsi minority. And the system of cattle vassalage became viewed as a system of exploitation of Hutu by Tutsi, because Hutu and Tutsi used to share cattle because the Tutsi were identified by cattle and the Hutu as farmers. They lived in a way they could exchange. So the colonizers created pseudo-racial ethnic identities to deliberately divide the Rwandan against each other. As a result, the evil of genocide is traced directly back to these European colonial who divided and ruled in order to make sure that they colonize Rwandan. The role played by the colonizers in planting the seed of ethnic ideology that can be classified into three main categories. The first one is racial theory. They planted a seed which is racial theory initiated and propagated by Belgium colonialists, which constructed the Hutu as indigenous Bantu and the Tutsi as Hamite. The second ideology was related to the introduction of identity card in order to maintain the fluid class to fixed classes and to identify individual in according to their label on the identity card. It was a way of forbidding the Hutu to move from their class or the Tutsi, because it was not like ethnic group, but class of socio-economic class. So by introducing identity card, it was a way to maintain this class, not to move from one class to another. The third planting seed from the colonial, it is the theory of origin, which portrays that the Tutsi are foreigners, invaders. So the colonizers privileged the Tutsi minority and discriminated against the Hutu majority. This led to different forms of structural violence, discrimination, and exclusion of Hutu. This tension of ethnic divided and colonial domination resulted in the 1959 Hutu revolution, where power was taken by those of Hutu ethnicity, followed by the killing of many Tutsis, which provoked a mass flow of Tutsi refugees to the neighboring countries. During the post-colonial era, Rwandan elite inherited and spread that ideology that has been constructed during the colonial era. Throughout the history of post-colonial Rwanda, ethnic ideology began to spread across the Rwandan society. The 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda was therefore the massacre which was culminated of the earlier genocides and massacres that happened in 1959, 1963, 1964, 1973, 1990, 1992, and 1993. So the 94 genocide was the final solution to exterminate and to finish in the entire community or ethnic group from the Tutsi community. So genocide, it is still impossible to understand that in a space of 3 months, 1 million of people were killed during the genocide that happened in Rwanda. Nowhere in the history have so many people who have been killed in such short period of time. The speed, ferocity to which the genocide was executed left the country destroyed. The killing, the rape, torture, maiming babies, youth, children, and all ages. The country was completely destroyed. 3 million of Rwandans became refugees, especially the Hutu, who feared reprisal, eventually fled to the neighboring country and fled with their leaders into exile. Almost about 1 million also were internally displaced. There are many consequences of genocide, but we can't go far. This was the context in which the colonizers planted a seed of ethnic ideology, which was inherited by the Rwandans themselves until there happened a lot of massacres, as I mentioned, and finally the genocide that happened in 94. Let me move on the massacres that happened in DRC. The DRC Congo is a nation within a circle of violence, which beginning of 1885 with the King Leopold, who was a Belgium. He conquered the territory. The land has been raped because of its natural resources, and the people were abused by those that attempt to control the area because of the interest of having the mineral richness from DRC. The British explorer Henry Stanley first traveled down to the Congo River and discovered the riches of the land in 1871. When the news of its vast resources reached Europe, King Leopold of Belgium established the Association International African and Organization to aid in the colonization of the Congo, masked as humanitarian venture. Leopold employed Stanley to return to the African continent and acquire as much land as possible. Under this pretext of humanitarian aid, King Leopold of Belgium funded exploration of an area he would name the Congo Free State. He officially acquired the territory by the permission of European nations in the Conference of Berlin in 1885, making it his private property. The land was not considered a colony of Belgium, but it was honored directly by King Leopold. Leopold soon began harvesting the land copious resource. The demand for rubber especially rose in 1890s when the growing popularity of bicycles and cars called for rubber tires. The exploitation of the land quickly went hand in hand with the exploitation of its population. Leopold and his executive forced native Congolese to work, often under horrible conditions. King Leopold was brutal in his confiscation of resources. At the demand for rubber rose, Leopold made the Free State of Congo his personal rubber plant. It was estimated that during his rule, the population was cut in half by the killing and the massacre that happened in DRC during the time of Leopold. Brutal techniques were employed by the army to coerce the population to increase rubber production output. The most utilized punishment for not meeting quota was the loss of one arm, which was a common at that time. It is estimated that about 10 million native peoples were killed as the result of this exploitation, but also with disease during the first wave of colonization. Leopold's methods were extremely unpopular. Black conscripts in his army often joined the rebel they were supposed to be fighting. And many Protestant missionaries also began what was maybe considered as the first humanitarian human rights movement. The European and the American public protest heavily once this atrocity came to light. So Leopold lost all the support and financial backing. He was transferred of Congo Free State. He transferred the Congo Free State, which was his own property, to the Belgium in 1908. And as a result, this plunder became slightly less destructive. In short, I may say that during this colonial period in DRC, especially with Leopold who massacred many people in DRC, it is like this massacre is an untold story because they don't talk much about this context. But as you heard, many people were injured, many people were killed in a very tragic way during this time of Leopold Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very traumatic experiences. Now let's hear from Frank, Reverend Dr. Frank Chikane from South Africa.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It's a pleasure to share this platform with all the brothers and sisters who are part of the panelists and learning from their experiences as well. From South Africa, there are many massacres that one could speak about over the whole 350 years of colonial experience and of apartheid. But I'm going to pick up just one experience that is well known in South Africa, which is called the Shapville Massacre. Those who do not know the history of South Africa is that many people always say the Afrikaners are responsible for apartheid. I always say the English laid the platform and the framework for a racist legal system which the Afrikaners institutionalized into what was then called apartheid in 1948. Before 1948, the land that was occupied by Black people in South Africa was taken, and they remained with 13% of the land. 87% of the land was made part of what is called white South Africa. And for you to control people, you had to confine them into those spaces, control them using a past laws, which determined where people can work, where people can go to school, where people can live. And in the 1950s, these past laws were intensified to control people. And it really deprived you of your rights. For instance, I was in Johannesburg, but I was treated as an outsider. I had a number which said 200, which means you belong to another place, not in this white area. Here, you are here whilst looking for work or being at school or working for somebody. If you are not, you need to leave the place. And so this passbook was an intense control mechanism of apartheid. In fact, I still have my old passbooks where even when I was in a university, the vice chancellor there had to sign through the administration that I'm still a student in that university, because they needed to know where each one of us is. And that I couldn't go to Wits University because it was for whites, and I had to go to Tefluop, which is for Northern Sotho speaking people. It's even ethnical. And because of this, which really was an oppressive machinery, the people of South Africa said, no, we are not going to comply. They went on a defiance campaign and took these passbooks to go and drop them in the nearest police station. And that's when the Shapville Massacre happened. The Shapville is in the Vaal Triangle, south of the Gauteng province as we know it today. And on that day, people marched peacefully to a police station to go and hand over these passbooks. And that's when they were massacred, and 69 people were killed on the spot, 180 were injured, and it happened also in a number of other places, like in Cape Town, within a day or so. And so many people were killed. And because of that, Shapville has become part of our history. And that's why today, because we are free, we made Shapville Day a Human Rights Day, because that's when the rights of the people of South Africa were violated. But it also became a landmark for the intensification of the struggle in South Africa. And the armed struggle also was introduced after that, because people felt they were being killed as defenseless people. And then we had a number of massacres after June 16, 1976, and a number in the 80s, ending up with Patong massacre, which we have no time to talk about. But those massacres left scars in the lives of the people, which have never been forgotten. There are still people who are still alive, who are victims, and still speak about it, and those who lost their parents, fathers, mothers, and that has become part of our history. And the question is, how do we actually acknowledge this? and make sure that people remember it in a way that enriches their history and their future to understand better what they need to be doing as a people. I would like to stop there. I just want to say most of these massacres are really based on racism, because you had to treat people as less than human beings to murder them in the way in which they were murdered. But we can talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have heard, very sad stories, stories of trauma that, have been experienced, by people, on the African continent. What we have heard are only examples, but each African country has a story to tell, right? So now I'll hand over to Mike, to help us, reflect on this, from a spiritual perspective.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And as we go into this moment of reflection, and having listened to all of our speakers so far, I also want to remind us all today that as we focus on these events that took place during colonial times, we here at the WCC are actually continuing to work on a booklet that will highlight more of these stories of massacres that we are not able to capture within the short time that we have here in this webinar. However, we go before God in this moment, and so I invite us, let us pray. Merciful God, we pause at this time, acknowledging the pain of our history. We pause, acknowledging that as your people, we lament, mindful of the many ways in which we have suffered in so many ways that these have left us traumatized, in pain, burdened, broken. And yet, as we remember, we do so knowing that you have journeyed with us and that you are the God who heals, the God who restores, the God who is able to make all things new. And so even as we remember and as we lament, we do so with hope, the resurrection hope. We do so mindful that you have never abandoned us and that you will continue to journey with us. And so we move forward, not forgetting the past, but remembering that because you have been with us in the past, you continue to be with us now and indeed into the future. And so we pray for your continued presence to abide with us in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We continue in this time of quiet prayer as we listen to the song.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's quite heavy, what we have heard, and we wouldn't want to stop, where we are just, pulled down by our histories of brutality that, the African people have experienced over so many decades. So I want to turn to an experience, from a church, right? So that's why we invited, to have with us an expert on healing of memories. So, Father Michael, how would you say a nation can transcend these past massacres and move towards healing? What are the lessons, from these tragedies, and how do we ensure that the future generations learn from the past, ensuring that history will not be repeated?
Thank you, Dr. Isabel. I must say I'm kind of feeling overwhelmed by the depth and the scale of pain that we are hearing from across our mother continent. I was glad that my brother Mikey began his prayer with speaking about the pain. And so I think and also I'm part of an institute for healing of memories that seeks to contribute to the healing journey of individuals, communities, and nations. And we started life as a parallel process to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's also part of how I dealt with what happened to me, a letter bomb from the apartheid state. But I want to talk about the importance and the power of acknowledgement. The importance of saying, yes, these things happened. Yes, it was true, and it was wrong. A terrible, and I think often when people are maltreated, even when massacred, those responsible claim that the victims were themselves bad people. And so we have to restore the moral order. And of course, that's an important of who tells the story. It needs to be the survivors, the relatives, the descendants are the ones most qualified to tell the story. And I think we also have to humanize. We talk about massacre, Frank talks about the 69 people, 189 people, but there's an individual story. There's a mother, a father, a brother, a sister. And I think we're beginning in history to write the personal stories, to humanize those individuals. And I think that is very important. So in our work of healing of memories, we speak a lot about acknowledgement. But I was in the Sami community, the indigenous people in the northern part of Norway, Sweden, Finland. And they said in Norway specifically, they said the king has acknowledged the wrong that was done to us. They said, that was good. They said, the problem is there's actually in the community and in the mainstream of the nation, no knowledge about what was being acknowledged. And so it helped me to see that knowledge is important as acknowledgement. So, for example, in our countries, like we remember, as Frank has said, Human Rights Day, the Shapville Massacre. But do our children know what happened? Do they know the stories? Do they know that what led to it? And I think it's very important that kids are kids, and for them, it's just another holiday. And we have to find creative and accessible ways of teaching a younger generation about what happened. But there's another organization I came across years ago in the States. It's called Facing History. And it was a particular organization relating to the genocide of what happened to the Holocaust, to the Jewish people. But the organization focused on what were the choices that led to that genocide. And I think we need to be clear when we look at history, not just in Africa, that often the victims in one generation become the perpetrators in the next. So there's a fundamental question. Like I was glad my sister spoke about the genocide in Rwanda. For me, the central question is, how do we avoid the genocide of tomorrow? And how we avoid it depends on how we deal with the past. And if I take the example of Rwanda, whose stories do we only tell? For example, if I can just give an example, there were people who were Hutu who defended Tutsis, and vice versa. But sometimes we ethnicize the whole story because it's very convenient, and then we create the bitterness and the hatred of tomorrow. So how we remember is as important as remembering. Because this learning the lessons, learning the choices that led, and I think it's always when we exclude a people, often they become the victims of genocide tomorrow. So whenever we demonize a people, eventually we give ourselves permission to do the most terrible things to them. And of course, Frank, towards the end, made the point that so many of these stories are about racism. But of course, we've had massacres in democratic South Africa as well. So the cycle continues. And what that speaks to is intergenerational trauma. And I think we want to distinguish between what a nation can do, like it can have a national memorial, it can have a national day, but often the nation moves on, but individual families and descendants are left with their scars and wounds being unattended. So you can have the nation that says, we've dealt with that, but the community who are most effective remain angry, frustrated, and bitter because their wounds have not been attended to. So we need to attend to the individual wounds at the same time as attending to the national story. And I think also within that process, apology has its place, but there's a journey to apology and there's a journey from apology. Where sometimes we turn this as, okay, we've apologized, end of story. But we don't, and I think we're going to come to in this conversation a bit about the role of reparations, both the symbolic role, but also the actual role. So I think those are the thoughts that I'd want to share, but emphasizing importance of knowledge and acknowledgement, of giving of moral content, of learning the lessons from the past.
Thank you so much for what we have heard, from Michael, especially Father Michael, especially reminding us, that individual healing is as important as the national healing. So now we open the floor to questions and the comments, from the participants. And I would ask Reverend Mikey, to share with us, questions that are coming from the chat room.
Thank you so much, Isabel. We have had some very wonderful and positive comments. And let me begin, though, with a question from John Chorney. And he said here, he would love to hear how the Moors, the Curlies, and the Lari's Massacre one another as part of this course. And they denied themselves the same status that they had no idea existed before. I'm not too sure which one of our speakers can speak to that. Yes, go ahead.
I remembered actually that we've missed two sessions actually. We wanted to hear a song that would help lament this experience, what we have heard. So I would say, let's hear that first.
And we come back to the questions.
I would also I would want the panelists to share with us again how their countries are remembering, these massacres, and whether there have been any reparations, because we've heard from the expert that reparations are very important as a process of healing. So let's hear the song first. Right. The song, helps us to lament. And the questions that are coming from the people, should also help us reflect on, what have we done? So I would still ask, that we hear the questions, let the panelists hear the questions, and then when we move to the next session, they will answer the questions together with what I would ask them to present. So Mike, go ahead and share with us the questions.
Thank you, Isabel. It's almost difficult to find the words after such a moving rendition of Senseni now, but from Didier, this question, I would like to know concretely what we can do as churches with, of course, the thousands of internally displaced persons. He speaks directly to the situation in Burkina Faso for the last 5 years. And of course, I guess that question is, how do we address issues now as ways of learning from experiences of the past? Nikki asked about the question of scapegoating. How do we move past this layered trauma? And from Ibun, we have another question. How different is our history from the past to the narrative of today? And Didier also comes back and references the testimony of Father Michael, which he thinks is very moving, and was wondering how, as a church, we can work upstream to avoid such situations in our countries, which I guess goes back to how do you acknowledge without first acknowledging that there is the knowledge, of course. And the initial question about the Moors and the Curlies and the Lari's massacre, how they fit into, and I guess maybe our publication will speak to those. So those are some of the questions, and I don't know which one of our panelists can track one of them.
Right. So maybe let's start with Father Michael to answer those that apply to him. And then later on, I'll ask the panelists to respond to theirs.
Well, I suppose the question about scapegoating is the most interesting. Is that we find it easier to blame than take responsibility for our part. But I think one of the things we've learned as an institute that all human beings are capable of being both perpetrators and victims. Most of us are very clear about the ways we're victims and a bit hazy about the ways we're perpetrators. And I think we see this particularly in gender-based violence, that I may be a victim in the workplace and I can be a perpetrator in the bedroom. And I think we've got to see the connection between our traumas as nations and what happens in relation to gender-based violence in particular, and see that kind of cycle and the interconnection. So we've got to actually look at the ways in which we have intergenerational wounds. But when we talk about the role of churches, I think it has to be holistic. So, I mean, when it comes to displaced person, they have economic needs, they have need for bread, they have need for livelihood, but they also have psychological, emotional, and spiritual needs. I mean, Jesus says human beings cannot live by bread alone, but didn't say a human being can live without bread. So yes to the bread, but yes also to a space to deal with our wounds. But I think also we need to have intergenerational conversations where the parents and the grandparents can tell their children what happened to them, but the children can also almost unculturally have the opportunity to respond and say, yes, but we're also experiencing your pain. As well, and how you've been affected by what happens to us. So there's just a couple of thoughts to throw in.
Thank you so much.
And Isabel, if I can just jump in here, I should have mentioned Dion's question, which is how do you suggest we as people of faith begin to address the issues of deep mistrust and skepticism of people in power so that we can genuinely move to a place of true healing? So that's also, I guess, part of the same continuation of healing the wounds.
Is it wrong to be skeptical? I mean, I say, in a way, we've got to see that people in power can be like us, but as people of faith, it's about holding each other responsible. I think in a way in South Africa, 94 came and said, okay, well, we are free now, they can run the government. What a terrible mistake. And look where we are now. And so in a sense, it's about all of us taking responsibility. So we should be skeptical of government, but also be skeptical of ourselves. And as church, we also have to self-examine and not just blame, and see the degree to which we ourselves may be, part of the problem. But I think step one is recognizing our own woundedness, because that means we can ourselves be on journeys of healing and listening, as we have been doing today, to one another's pain.
I like, what you said about, victims can become perpetrators, because, this session, we are concentrating on what happened during the colonial period, right? But as Frank said, there are so many massacres that have even happened during the post-colonial period. So we need another session when we can look at these massacres that are being perpetrated by the former victims, right? So I want to go to the panelists now, and I want to ask you each in 5 minutes to look at, how are these foreign heroes in your respective countries remembered? How do we honor their martyrdom? What is done to prevent these victims from falling into amnesia or denial? How do we memorize these tragedies? Are monuments helpful, or are they enough? What about reparations to descendants of these victims? Has there been any apologies? So let's start again with Madame Fasino. 5 minutes.
I think she lost her connection.
Yes, Isabel, I think we lost her connection, unfortunately.
At some point, then I would ask our communication colleagues, to share with us the video where she answers this question. But in the meantime, let's go to Mr. Maroki.
Yes, I am on. Thank you very much. Very briefly, first of all, let me appreciate Father Michael talking about parents informing their children and sharing the story. I am personally myself, my mother was a Mau Mau War veteran, so I'm a son of the Mau Mau War veteran. And most of the stories that I know about the war is what my mother shared with me. And in fact, Michael, Father, I would like to sing to you a song that my mother shared with me. She used to sing in the forest when they were fighting for independence. And the song is very brief. It says, Twadhiaga tu kenete, tugashoka tu kenete, iwedo rwitu rwari rwega, tugethie na tugishoka. So you see, these are songs that were taught to me by my mother. It simply says, we were fighting for our independence. We were happy about it. We are happy for what we did. So these songs and other oral history is very, very important. And I'm very proud that my mother taught me these liberation wars. I am glad to teach them to my children. Now, regarding the reparation, this is one thing that has never been properly done in my country. Most of the Mau Mau War veterans are still ravaging in poverty. They lost their land, they lost their property. The men, especially, unfortunately, they were castrated. Their parents who are still suffering from barrenness because their parents were done so many things that affected their body and their reproductive system. So there has never been proper compensation. And even right now, there are some court cases that are going on in London so that the British government can be requested to compensate some of the tortures, some of the annihilation they caused on human beings. And really, the children of the veterans of the war, they are still suffering. They need to be compensated. And most important, they need to be appreciated. Now, I know you have asked whether we recognize these heroes. Well, we do. Every 12th of December, we remember the day of our independence. And we have now changed the day from Kenyatta Day to Heroes Day. So this day is set aside to remember the day of our independence, but most importantly, to recognize the heroism of our people, the men and women who went to the war, the men and women who forwent their everything to fight for independence. So we recognize them. Yes, sometimes it is not enough, but the government is doing something to recognize them. We have also moved just from recognizing the freedom heroes. We also recognize other people who have achieved great things, like our athletes, our academicians, our pastors, all the people who have done great things for this country. We recognize them. But I think the most important thing is to let the children know the history of our country and where we are coming from, so that we teach people the need to recognize human dignity, to appreciate people's effort, to fight human rights violations, and most important, to let people appreciate their dignity and human dignity, and to say that as much as we have come from far, there is also an element of turning back, even from the current administrators, the current governments. They need to be taught to respect human dignity and to respect human life, because these are still being perpetuated, not by the colonialists anymore, but even by our own political leaders. I think it's very important to honor people's dignity and people's rights. And I hope that at one stage, even people like myself, whose parents suffered from the colonial yoke, can get some compensation and nothing else, even appreciation from the government, that we all appreciate what your parents did to bring this country to independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Right, let's also hear from Reverend Dr. Mukey.
Okay, thank you. Concerning how the question on how do we recognize these past tragedies, I think the way that can be used to recognize is naming the evil. The most challenging issue is that in most cases, for example, in DRC, it is, as I said, it is like untold story. Since DRC still suffer from war and conflict till today, I don't know if there are many programs whereby this issue of massacres that happened during the colonial period are mentioned or are addressed. But either in DRC or in Rwanda, where I am living, let me mention how is it done in Rwanda. The best way to recognize the past tragedy is to name the evil, to break the silence. Because in many cases, the perpetrators try to hide the sign and even to cover up what happened. So whenever, and also even deny what happened. There are a lot of denial related to the massacres and genocide and the other killings. So the best way is to name the evil, but also break that silence. But also, in order to celebrate the survival life and the resilience, we have to talk about it, to share, to give the space, especially to the victims, to give them the space whereby they can share their painful stories. So the space, and I think here the church is the best place where people can share their stories, because people trust the church. And one of the people who are joining this webinar asked the question how this deep mistrust can be healed, and we move to the healing. I think the church is the best place whereby we can, because healing and especially in Rwanda, whereby the neighbor killed the neighbor, it was not easy to put these people together again, whereby the perpetrator has to sit together with the victim. But in the church, all of them come there, and the more people come together, the more fear reduce, prejudices reduce, and also mistrust reduce. then there can be a journey of talking together, but also having these sharing stories. And also, in some cases, people tend to focus only on the survivors, forgetting the perpetrators. But also they suffer from the guilty. They also need attention because they also suffer this guilty inside. So if we want to build a community or a society whereby all people are going together in the journey of healing, we need to give this space of sharing their painful story, but also sharing the truth of what happened together. And how do we remember or honor the hero? In Rwanda, for example, when we remember, we have always a annual commemoration remembering the genocide against the Tutsi. And during this period, the hero, especially those who made great job of saving, I think one of us mentioned about it, whereby most of Tutsi who survived, they were helped by the Hutu who are from the perpetrators community. So during this period, those who made this sacrifice of hiding some people, of helping the people to survive, they were also recognized as heroes because they refused to accept the evil. So this is a kind of during remembering, it is helping the people who survive to remember of what happened, but also to give this honor to those who helped. In order to prevent genocide or other massacres, the strategy that can be used is teaching the new generation. As my brother from Kenya said, the new generation need to have information. They need knowledge about what happened. We have to transmit the true message, not the wrong message. Teaching the new generation on what happened, but also teaching the strategy of peace building. Because as our father said, the victim of yesterday become the perpetrators of today. It is what happened in Rwanda, whereby the Hutu used to be the victim, but during genocide, they became the perpetrators. So when wounds are not healed, then we are producing the next generation who are violent. In order to prevent that, we have to teach the new generation, the younger people, about what happened in our countries, our history, but also teaching them peace building strategy. But yeah. And finally, I would say that healing is not something that happened once. It is a process. It is a journey. We have to journey without being tired. And Professor Piri asked about the monument. Is the monument important? I think it is very important to have a monument because it will teach the new generation, and also it will tell them this happened, and also help us to say never again. To what happened should not happen again in any country.
And Isabel, thank you so much, Dr. Mukey. Isabel, if I may just jump in before Frank comes in, because I want Frank in his closing comment and answering the question to also bear in mind the question that we got, Frank, from Catherine, who's from the working group of experts on people of African descent. And that question was, what message would you have as well for the UN human rights body? So I think, Frank, you're also in a position that you can also speak to Catherine's question as you share your closing comments.
Okay, so let's have Reverend Dr. Chikane, please.
Frank, you're muted. Dr. Chikane, you're muted.
Yeah, I must say that we're trying to deal with a very difficult subject within a limited amount of time. And that makes it even much more difficult. Let me just sum up in a summary way, because I realize we don't have time. As South Africans, we have tried to acknowledge, recognize, have monuments, days of recognition and all that. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where victims and perpetrators went to. unfortunately, those who are perpetrators went more for amnesty rather than really to say, I'm really sorry. And some of them did, but not many. We also have a challenge because so many people were tortured, so many people were brutalized, that recognizing one means you have ignored another. And that's a challenge. Then there's the issue of reparation. And if the majority of the people in South Africa were victims of the apartheid system, it's not only those who went into exile, those of us who were detained and tortured, but it's ordinary people who were victims. And the question is how you deal with that. I just want to say it's a difficult subject for me because it affects me directly. And in the same way as Father Lepsley, who's a more, you can see the damage that the bomb did on him, the letter bomb. Some of us are carrying it inside. I tried myself to have an event where we brought all the people who were hiding me, took care of me when I was underground, doctors who took care of me when I was underground. I had to go to the hospital underground in the night to be treated. And the torture that goes with it when you are in detention. And so for me, it's not only monuments, it's not only recognition and admission, but it's also whether it was worth it for me. And what hurts me more is that which we struggled for becomes something that looks like a mirage, which you are not achieving in the new society. And that's what hurts me, and it's more traumatic for me, like the woman who just got killed, assassinated this week, because she's a witness against corruption of our own comrades who are in government. And I think that to me is the pain. So if you want to ask me, the pain about the past is the fact that that past, that the objectives of the past are not realized in a way that will make you get healed. So what will heal me is when we achieve what we suffered for. And many people are in that category. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
That's why we were saying.
Just to say that I don't have time with the people of African descent, but we are heading for a conference that's going to deal with those issues, reparations and the pain by October. So I won't take the time now.
Yeah. So I'm glad you've mentioned, the Africa and Africans in the Diaspora conference that is coming in October, that continues this conversation. And I'm hoping that, as many people, as they are on this webinar, will register for that one so that we can continue with this conversation. I don't know whether we are now able to hear from Mrs. Fasino.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a video in French, so please select the interpretation channel.
Okay.
Mais après le pillage, après ce massacre, quels sont les efforts de réparation qui ont été faits? En réalité, après une guerre de ce genre, il y a deux types de réparations. Il y a d'abord les réparations dues aux préjudices moraux que les populations ont subis, puis des tentatives de restitution des objets qui ont été pillés. En ce qui concerne la réparation à la suite des préjudices moraux, dans toutes nos recherches, nulle part, nous n'avons eu des éléments nous permettant de savoir qu'il une réparation morale a été faite. Il n'y a pas eu de réparation jusqu'à ce jour. Par contre, au niveau des objets qui ont été pillés, il y a eu des tentatives de restitution, mais jusque-là, rien de concret n'a été fait. La plupart des bronzes qui ont été pillés ont été achetés par les Allemands parce que pour l'expédition, il s'agissait de vendre ces pièces pour rentrer en possession des fonds qui ont servi à l'expédition. Donc ces pièces de bronze ont été vendues aux Allemands et se sont retrouvées un peu partout dans le monde entier. Certaines pièces ont été offertes aux soldats qui ont participé à l'expédition en titre de cadeau. Et 40% de ces œuvres se trouvent actuellement dans les galeries du British Museum. Depuis quelques années, des pourparlers sont en cours entre le ministère allemand des Affaires étrangères et le Nigeria pour la restitution de ces pièces qui existent chez eux. Il est prévu également la construction d'un musée au Nigeria, dans le royaume du Bénin, pour abriter ces œuvres. En 2014, 2 sculptures de bronze ont été rendues lors d'une cérémonie officielle au roi par les descendants d'un soldat britannique qui ont participé à l'expédition. De la même manière, des manifestations estudiantines en Allemagne ont eu lieu pour réclamer la restitution des bronzes qui se trouvent en Allemagne. Mais suite à cela, jusqu'à présent, on attend des actes concrets et nous espérons que bientôt, dans quelques années certainement, que la restitution se fera progressivement.
Thank you so much. Right. Unfortunately, time is against us, and we are not able to open again to the floor and hear the questions and answers. So I would like to conclude the session by saying that the stories we've heard today, we chose a few countries, Benin, Kenya, Rwanda, DRC, South Africa, but these are the stories of every African country. Right? If each one of us had a chance to share our experiences or the experiences of our grandparents or our great-grandparents, it will be the same story everywhere. And then from the discussions we've had today, as I mentioned earlier on, I see the need, for us to have another session where we can look at how post-colonial Africa is suffering from the same issues now, which means that, the lessons have not been learned. And I concur with what, Reverend Chikane had said, that, the pain that is there for people who have gone through this, past traumas is when you see the current leaders, doing exactly the same to their own people. And so we need to look at this and say, okay, how then do we make sure that the current leaders are reminded of the need for acknowledgement, healing, and doing things differently. That's one point. The second point I wanted to make is that what we are discussing today is part of the theme of the pilgrimage of justice and peace. The theme is racism and indigenous peoples. So here we've heard, the experiences of the indigenous peoples of Africa and, how they've suffered in the colonial period. And there we highlighted the issue of racism, but we also see that, there is also ethnicity. Different aspects of racism are manifesting themselves in the stories that we've heard. The stories are stories of trauma. And trauma is one of the themes of the pilgrimage of justice and peace, that when you tell the truth, you tell the truth of your experiences of trauma. And one of the themes of the pilgrimage of justice and peace is also land and displacement of people. This was very clear in all the stories, that there has been displacement of people, and that in itself has not been corrected, because there are still tracts of land that are still owned by our former people who colonized us. They're still owning land in our countries, and we need to deal with these issues. And then we have heard stories of gender injustice, right? That wherever there is trauma, wherever there is displacement of people, there's also a particular pain that is experienced by women in the form of rape. And that too needs to be talked about and dealt with, because if it is not, it's one wound which only women experience, and we need to have a solution to that wound as well. And Father Michael talked about perpetrators, those who have been victims becoming perpetrators at home in terms of gender-based violence. And then the issue of racism, we need to discuss this issue again, because so far we've looked at racism in terms of people from the global north and the global south. But what we haven't discussed is the issue of xenophobia among ourselves, which is another wound that needs to be healed. So I want to thank my colleagues for organizing this webinar, and I want to thank our panelists for opening up to share with us the wounds from your countries, which we can also recognize as our own wounds. And thank you also to Father Michael to show us how the churches can play a role in bringing healing when there's so much pain happening. Thank you for those in communication who have helped us with our communication to make sure that this is going on well. And thank you to all the participants for coming. Sorry we couldn't field all your questions and your comments, but we have received them, and we thank you for each and every one of them. And so I invite Reverend Mikey Roberts to lead us into a prayer.
Thank you, Isabel. And for further information, please email us here at the World Council of Churches for any way that we can follow up and continue the conversation. Thanks again to all. Let us pray. Holy God, the fountain and source of all that is good, give strength to your people in moments of weakness. Give courage when we are fearful. Enlighten us when we feel surrounded by the powers of darkness, and affirm our resolve to be the people of God, the people whom you have called us to be. May we not grow weary in well-doing, but each day, empowered by your Spirit, may we lift our heads and our hands and declare boldly, we are the people of God, called from darkness into light. Help us then to walk in the resurrection power of Jesus Christ, so that each day we will declare the goodness of God in the land of the living. And that goodness is to all people and all creation. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
otro como kayo report ko NFO. Barki.
Okay, so thank you to everyone. Thank you.